So, I was watching YouTube the other day, and one of my favorite creators, Nerdslayer, put out a very good video about MMORPGs versus MORPGs. So, massive multiplayer online role-playing games versus multiplayer online role-playing games, and what the difference between both of them were. Essentially, the video said massive multiplayer online RPGs are, well, massive. They usually used to have 500 plus players, like games like EverQuest, Ashen Skull, Ultima Online, very old games at that. And with time, MMOs, right, the ones that we have today, essentially started, when they were being developed, started losing on this massive quality for smaller numbers, like, 50 plus players, maybe maximum 100 plus players in certain specific moments, but it was not based on that, right? Way more based on, well, story, or, being able to play these games solo, right? Now, of course, there's still MMOs are like these old games, like, what is this game called? EVE Online, of course, but it is very clear that, things have changed during the past of years, right? And of course, we also have the games like other multiplayer online RPGs, and some people even call them cooperative online RPGs, right? Like Guild Wars 1 or, what's the word? Phantasy Star Online, which are games that, they're online, of course, but they are essentially almost like instanced in the way they're played. And you play with other people and you interact, but, you lose a lot of the, you lose the world, you lose the massiveness of the world and the online game for this more tailored experience into an instance, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, and that was essentially the video. But I do have a bit of a problem, even though I think the video was honestly very good, and I really, it was honestly a perfect video. I think there's one thing that Nerdslayer is missing here, is honestly the fact that it doesn't matter how essentially things were called back in the day, like the reason why a massively multiplayer online RPG, the term was essentially created. It was because you could play with 500 plus people, an insane amount, a massive amount, if you will, of course. And even though that has changed, it doesn't mean that, the term that we have right now doesn't really apply to the online massive multiplayer RPGs that we have now, like Final Fantasy 14, like WoW, like Guild Wars 2, like WoW Classic, all of these things, right? And I think that's why a lot of people get mad a little bit on what he's saying, not because he's wrong, but because they feel a bit attacked by the fact that, they're essentially, he kind of is saying, well, what you say it's an MMORPG, it really isn't, all right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but it technically it isn't, right? And I think he is right, but I think what's happening is something like what happened with the term third world country that everyone uses nowadays. Because the term third world country essentially wasn't used for what we use it today. It used to be used, and it was created to categorize countries that were not aligned with the West or the East in the war, right? And that was essentially a third world country. But instead now, today, it is used to essentially describe developing countries that are not done with their development, and that's why we essentially use it in a very colloquial way, like, oh, that country, to, be as structured and stable as some other, like, other countries or more established countries, right? And of course, even though that is not the term that was used back in the day and why it was created, now we do use it this way. And honestly, whenever you say a third world country, no one's gonna think, oh, they mean if they were aligned in World War II with this country or not. No, they're gonna think about the developing country term instead, because that's how we use it. And I think that's kind of what is happening here right now on the MMO front. It's not that he's wrong about the MMORPGs not being like the way they used to, and essentially the new MMOs not really being real MMOs, but the fact that, well, now we essentially call the new MMOs, like Final Fantasy, like Guild Wars 2, like WoW, like WoW Classic, MMOs, even though they don't have this massive quality to them, right? They are massive in some ways. You can play in specific moments with 50 plus people, with 100 plus people, and sometimes even games like WoW Classic and Guild Wars 2 are almost based upon this, massive, but not to the extent to what all the other MMOs, the original ones, were, right? So they still don't really count as massive multiplayer online RPGs, right? And I think this is where the disconnect kind of happens. And we have a problem, and I think I'm not gonna say that Nerdslayer is wrong about bringing this out, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation, and we couldn't be talking about what the category should be called, or what we should do about this, because we have a problem right now. Right now, we don't have a good term for new MMORPGs or old MMORPGs. We have to pick one. I think we have two real terms: MMOs and online RPGs. I think online RPGs honestly sounds pretty good for games like Guild Wars 1 or Phantasy Star Online, because they're a very focused experience with a very focused type of amount of people every time in instances, right? Because you get your instance with 5 people, that's why you play with it, and there probably may be some game modes with more people, whatever, but it's very, very established. That's the amount of people you want to go into instances with, and that's it. That's how the game is designed. In Guild Wars 1, even if you want to play solo, essentially the game will give you party members, bots, to play with you, because that's how the game mode is supposed to go anyways, right? But then we have this problem. Now we cannot, as the new MMO ones. For example, you can't really say that WoW, Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars 2, ESO, Sword, or Black Desert, or whatever, are online RPGs, because that way, this one would have no name, right? I guess you could indeed call this one's cooperative RPGs, and this one's online RPGs, right? You could do that, but then the problem is, well, new MMOs like these ones are the popular ones, and right now everyone calls this an MMO, right? If you think, wow, I want to play an MMO right now, what are you gonna do? You're gonna think about WoW, Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars 2, ESO, all of these ones. You're not gonna be thinking about Ashen Skull, EverQuest, Ultima Online, even if they're truly massive. So I have this little problem where, how should we call them? I'm honestly not sure. I think honestly this one should be called MMOs, MMORPGs, because that's how we use the term right now, and that's kind of how it has moved to. But of course, the other ones should be called in a specific way, right? Now, how could this be? How could we call them? Honestly, it's kind of hard. It could be old MMORPGs, MMORPGs, or maybe mega MMORPGs, mega massive multiplayer online role-playing games. There could be a lot of names. And I guess maybe you could just say, well, we should just have the old MMORPGs and the modern MMORPGs. The modern being the ones that maybe are not as focused as the massive part of the game, and they're not as they don't have as many people either, right? They only have 100 plus people instead of having 500 plus people, but they also do have these specific places where they do have a massive content where you interact with a lot of people. And the old RPGs, old MMORPGs have essentially very big amounts of people, right? And they're almost focused in those interactions instead. But I do think it's important. I think it would be a bit better if we make it a bit more than just modern MMORPGs and old MMORPGs, because otherwise, I mean, what does an old and modern MMORPG even mean? Like, if you don't know the history, how would you differentiate those two things? Better to have the name actually say what the category actually is. It is important to categorize things correctly, especially for developers, for them to actually focus on how they want to make their own game, right? You don't want to, whenever you make an online RPG or an MMO or an old MMO like Ashen Skull, each of these categories give something out. They sacrifice something to get something else, right? Massive multiplayer online RPGs, the old ones, Ashen Skull, all of these ones, they sacrifice on accessibility. They sacrifice on solo play a little bit. You can still do it, but they do sacrifice on this. They sacrifice on story for the possibility to be massive, for the possibility for players to create their own story in the world. Because if you're massive with 500 plus people and interacting with them all the time and playing game modes with all of these people, like in the world and everything, of course you're not going to have a very tailored experience. It's not going to happen. And there's nothing wrong with sacrificing that for this other thing. But then again, if you have a new modern MMORPG, you're going to sacrifice on the massiveness of it for better graphics, for better accessibility, for better story, for all of these things. You can see this in something like Final Fantasy, where, of course, they sacrifice on a lot of the massiveness, especially in the leveling process, in order for you to have a very tailored experience in the story and understand what's happening and everything. And you just go in, you want to play a story online RPG, you go in and you do it. I still would consider it as massive, especially because in the end game it does expand a lot, and you can play a lot with a lot of people. They do raids. They do raids with 50 plus people in specific zones. They do big events like bounty trains that we have in Guru, but instead of Final Fantasy, where essentially you go around with 100 plus people, 200 people, even 300, going around to these bosses that they gonna essentially kill to get some loots, right? And you have the Golden Saucer, where essentially you have mini games with 50 plus people as well. Then sure, you're not gonna have a very meaningful experience with, but you are playing with them. And let's be real, it's not very easy to have a very big interactive experience with 50 plus people. That they sacrifice in some ways, in the sense that their world may be a bit more boring, especially in the leveling process, but bro, like, they still have most of the massiveness that any other MMO would have. It's just separated. And of course, I don't think even Nerdslayer would say that this is bad, but I think it's still, a massive part of the game. It makes it an MMO. And honestly, they found the perfect way to do it by separating each game mode into a different place. They don't actually contaminate each other, and they can do what those game modes do very well. If they have to be massive, they are massive. If they have to be focused, like raids or like story, they can be focused on that. And honestly, that's very, 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 very good for what they're doing, right? They do it very well, and it works perfectly, and people love it, right? Of course, that makes it for a worse, maybe less immersive and interesting world, but that's why we have other games like Classic WoW, like Guild Wars 2, right? And of course, something like WoW Classic does kind of the opposite that Final Fantasy does. They sacrifice the possibility of having a linear story to have a very open story in the world, where people interact with each other, and you essentially bring in the world for you, and you experience the world the way you want to, right? And they can have a more massive experience with seeing a lot of people in the world with you. A world that is very threatening. A world that you can actually PvP with people in the world while you're playing, while you're leveling. Events like Ankirach, the opening of the gates, right? Raids with 40 people, right? All of these things are some things that you gain by sacrificing on other things, right? Guild Wars 2 kind of sacrifices a lot to get a little bit of everything, which in some ways, it does it pretty well, but in some ways, it gets a worse story than Final Fantasy XIV, and in some ways, a worse world than WoW Classic. But they have both. They have a little bit of both, and of course, other things like War of Assault and PvP and all of these things, right? But they do their sacrifices for the game mode, for the game they want to create. I think we need to be careful thinking that because you sacrifice on something in your game, that means that the game is worse. You always have to make sacrifices in order to get something better. That is just how life works and how video gaming, video game making works. If you want to have a good story, you're going to have a lot of dialogue, and that means that you're going to have less gameplay. And that's okay if you want to get that experience. There's nothing wrong with that. And it goes for any decision in MMORPGs, in any decision that a developer is going to be making. You're going to sacrifice on some things to make other ones better. And there's nothing wrong with that. And of course, we also have the cooperative multiplayer RPGs, like Guild Wars 1 and Phantasy Star Online, which sacrifice the massiveness completely to focus on what they do specifically very well, right? In an instance type of content. They sacrifice the world for it, but people really like them even then. And there's nothing wrong with all of these things. But of course, if you start talking about MMORPGs and we categorize all of these type of games into one bubble, essentially, what are we asking for? When the community says, I want an MMORPG, what is the developer going to say? Do they want one like Guild Wars 1, like one Guild Wars 2, one like WoW Classic, one like Final Fantasy XIV, one like Ashen Skull? It is very important for us to know what we want so we can tell the developers, and of course the developers know how to, pick up on the things they want to do. As Nerdslayer says in the video as well, Joshi P knew exactly what he was going for, and it worked pretty well. He sacrificed on things he wanted to sacrifice for to get an experience that he wanted to provide, and people loved that. At the end of the day, there's no problem with any of these games. and any of this category of games. As Nerdslayer says in this video, each type contributes in a different way to the space by having its own type of negatives and positives, disadvantages and advantages, and sacrifices for rewards. It is better if we understand these differences for us as players to communicate correctly to the developers, so they can do the games we want. We don't want developers being confused and making a game that appeals to no one. We want developers to focus on what they want to do, give us that experience, and see if we like it. Tell me if you guys agree with me. If you disagree with me, comment down below. Subscribe to Nerdslayer and subscribe to me if you want as well. But have a good one, guys. Love you all. Bye-bye.